Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. So it is so great to be here again. And it is fabulous to see so many familiar faces of parents, grandparents, and even a lot of new folks who I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet. So as Anne had said, my name's Caitlin. There we go. Everyone can see this next slide. All right. I have some tech anxiety sometimes, so I want to make sure it's good. Just let me know if it's not, okay? So I'm Caitlin, and as Anne said, work with many of the students at Taddle Creek Montessori, but am also connected in with other folks within the Mildenhall schools. So I am a teacher, but a number of years ago, I moved into reading intervention. And so I have a company called Sunrise Reading Solutions, and I typically work one-on-one with students who need support in literacy, whether that's reading, spelling, and writing as well. Now, that said, even though I work with a number of students one-on-one, a lot of the different structures and sciences of reading can be applied outside of that situation. So it can be done in classroom settings, it could be done at home, it could be cuddled up with your child. And so I'm hoping to give a lot of different tips and tricks that you can use starting as soon as maybe tomorrow, because it's getting late, that you can use with your children and grandchildren too. So if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat. Rebecca's going to keep track of those, and I will leave time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that come into your mind. All right. So you may have been somebody who's heard about the science of reading, sometimes called SOAR. This is a huge interdisciplinary collection of research basically about how the mind learns to read. And what's really cool about it is that it actually spans across languages. So while there's been a lot of things done in English to help us progress and help our students learn to read, the research it can expand beyond that. So if there are any bilingual folks or families here, the research that I'm sharing today can be applied in other ways, but of course I'm going to be focusing on the English applications. So SOAR, or the science of reading, is made up of 5 different components. And it's kind of neat because this hasn't changed in 80 years. They keep researching. Is there something different? Is there something we missed? But it's been, broken down to the 5 same components here. So phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency. And so I'm going to be, peppering the presentation with information on these 5 and then what you can do at home to support them. One particular approach that may be familiar to you is that of the Orton-Gillingham approach, also called OG. And so that's something that I'm trained in and that I tend to use with my students. And what it does is it utilizes these components of the science of reading. And so if you are looking to help support your child in more depth than what I described today, something you may want to check out is the Orton-Gillingham Academy or the International Dyslexia Association. And you can learn a lot more about how this approach can be facilitated at home and elsewhere. Now, the cool thing about Orton-Gillingham and the science of reading in general is that it links to Montessori and the Montessori approach quite well. And so what pops into my mind is the fact that it's a very individualized approach. There's a lot of multisensory learning. There's a structured environment that has flexibility to adapt and to change with the needs of the students. And there's also a focus on mastery. So what I want to talk about is how we can take these components of the science of reading with Orton-Gillingham, the Montessori approach, and then bring that home. So we're going to be, at this point, looking at the different components of the science of reading, benchmarks and skills that you can look out for in your learner, and also myth busting about what reading is not. So I want to begin with the first component of the science of reading. And in many circles, this is considered sort of like the backbone. It's called phonological awareness. I'm not sure if you have heard of it before. It's quite a mouthful, but phonological awareness is something that all of us have, I can pretty much guarantee. It is the ability to recognize and then manipulate the sounds and structures of spoken language, basically. And so there's many different ways that we can do this, but they typically are taught in a way that is easier and more broad, and it gets harder and more specific as the student gets older and more experienced. So the first part of this is I guess, the easiest step you could say, and that's word awareness. So if you were the parent or guardian of a really, really small young learner, this would be something that I'm sure they're exploring every day. And it's the understanding that there are words that exist, they have meaning, and we need many different words to create a sentence. So something like clapping hands or tapping for each word, like the dog is barking, the understanding that there are four words in that sentence is actually something we have to be able to know to read and spell. Who knew? When it comes to word awareness, there are many different things we can do to facilitate this because I know a lot of students and young learners I work with sometimes don't quite understand. Maybe they write their sentences with no spaces at all of the words connect. They don't know where one word ends and then the other starts. So something to help with this that you can do at home is, well, I have a couple of different examples here. One of them is helping to study the fact that different sentences have words by physically counting them out. So if you look at the truck example here, who doesn't love trucks? If your student or child has a story or an interest, you can get one sentence, you could type it up even, and then actually show them that there are these spaces and then there's these letters, and those are words. So truck, a truck, a big truck, and I see a big truck. Again, very, very basic fundamental stuff, but this can be done in different ways too. You can also have a bit of like a building challenge with your child where you give them a sentence and then you have them use one block for every single word that they can count. And you could also do a lot of like oral wordplay. So creating silly stories where you say a word of a sentence and then your child says the next. So like and then they say dog, had, stinky shoes, something silly, something fun. You could do it on the bus. But the idea is we're building an awareness of words. I will also mention that the resources you see here, whether I discuss them or not, I am going to be putting together a document that has links to these. So if you want to explore them in more depth, you're welcome to do so on your own. The next component is getting a little bit more tricky when it comes to our manipulation of sounds and spoken structure, and that's of syllable awareness. So as we may know, syllables are a word or a word part that have a vowel sound in them. And all of our words are made up of one or more syllables. But being able to hear those is crucial if we're going to be able to write and we're going to be able to read. And so an example would be if you have the word banana, someone with syllable awareness should be able to detect that there are three syllables, banana. So to help facilitate this, there's a couple of activities here that I know my students really love. One of them is jumping. And what you do is you can get some electrical tape or whatever you'd like, some chalk, and you can give them a picture or a word, and you have them jump every time their chin drops. Because usually with syllables, our chin will drop. So hamburger, it's a bit defined there, but that is three syllables because my chin dropped. There were three vowel sounds. So they can jump those. You can also work on fine motor skills by having them clip the number of syllables in these cards here where there's pictures. Again, you can use interests. I, in fact, encourage it, especially at this age. In one way, you can also use their interest is by doing your daily activities, exploring their world, but then incorporating syllable awareness into it. So for example, if you're going on a nature walk, you can have them collect all their things. They'll probably do it anyway if they're young. And then when you get home, maybe you can help them sort the different, treasures they found into the syllable numbers that those artifacts have. So leaf or pine cone. And that can go for anything that they're putting in their pockets, really. The next level is what we call onset rhyme awareness. And this is the ability for us to hear the initial consonant or consonants in a word and to split that off from the vowel and everything after. So the easiest way is just to demonstrate. The word cat has k, that's the onset, and at is the rhyme. And so our students need to be able to actually manipulate those sounds and to split that up. For dream, it would be dr, eam. So the consonants and then the vowel and after. And this is a step before actually splitting up the word. If you can kind of see where I'm going, we began with word, syllable chunks, and now we're working on the beginning and then the rest. So one way to help practice this with your children is, and again, all of these can be pretty much made up, but most of the resources I'm showing here and will share are free as well. One that my students really love is actually, using a sort of a rhyming match game where you have a picture. Usually it's something really simple like hat. And then they have to look at the other pictures and then go, or sorry, I think that example is cap. Yeah. And they have to go look through the pictures and then dab the rhyme essentially. So something that ends in the app. And usually what we want is for the students to actually say this out loud so that they're getting the auditory feedback. And I'm going to explain why that's important in a little bit. But dotting is perfect, helps with those fine motor skills as well. Another great one is having these different pictures with the endings of words. So the rhyme part, like ugh, and then giving them letters if they're ready for it, and having them figure out what's the first sound. So j, ugh, b, ugh, creating that awareness of the onset and the rhyme. If you're not able to do that, or it's something that you've done already, another great one is nursery rhymes. There's a reason that these exist. They're a great way to play with language. 3 of my favorites are listed here. I'm sure some of you know them. But you can also do a quick YouTube search, and you may have some family favorites coming up soon as you play around with the sounds that are sounds and words that are in these songs. All right. So another last note I'll say too is, again, for our kids who love to collect, you can use a collection basket and have them go on a scavenger hunt where they're searching for words that rhyme. So for example, all right, we're going to go around the house and we're going to find anything that ends in at. And then maybe you go through a couple examples like k, at, b, at, h, at. What else can we find? Getting that awareness. All right. The next is phonemic awareness. Now, this one is the boss level. This is the hardest one, and it is the absolutely crucial for proficient reading and spelling. And this is where a lot of weaker readers struggle. And this is the ability to hear and identify and then manipulate the individual sounds in language. If that seems easy to you, it means you probably have strong phonemic awareness, but not everybody does. So an example is understanding that the word cat has 3 sounds or phonemes. K, a, t. Now, sorry, my brain was exploding with ideas, so I have a lot on the screen. I'm going to try and bring you through them. All right, so to practice this, there's a lot you could do. It's great news. I will also mention that this is a great stage to start introducing letters. So if you have an older child who is familiar with letters and the fact that letters have sounds and they can read them to varying degrees, this is absolutely something you can do with letters, but you don't have to. So in the first example here, I use the example of manipulating the word mat and getting the child to change it to become map. It is a big jump. This is not necessarily what you would start with, but this is an example of where we want to get to. We want to use blocks or rocks or some type of manipulative to have our child count out those sounds. So mat has ah, t. And then map has ah, h. And we want to encourage them to watch their mouth, feel their mouth, and see how how or where in the word there's a change. So sometimes with, pre-reading students, I might use colored blocks so that they're just listening and noticing that the end is different. And then they might swap out a new color for the end. But for readers, you could also have them manipulate this with foam letters or sandpaper letters too. And this is a really important skill. Another way you can do it is you can cut up a picture of whatever into the number of sounds it has. You want to keep it, not too long for the young ones, but something like leaf, you could cut into 3 and then have them put it together while sounding it out. So e, 3 sounds. Another really fun one, especially if they have any little critters, is, creating like I think there's like a lily pad style of game where they have the frog jumping from each sound. And you can see in this particular example where the reading starts to come into play. They're looking at the letters, but they're segmenting them into each of the individual sounds. And so this is critical for them. As well, for younger ones, you can have them color in pictures in sort of like an I Spy situation. Where you say, I spy, pictures that have an ah in them. And then they might go through and out loud, I might have them say, okay, what's that? A hat? At? Then they color it in. But ig, does that have ah? No. So that's, again, a way that you can work on fine motor, but also on the phonemic awareness skill. I like to use beads as well to count with my students, and board games. This is a great one. I encourage everybody to print because this one has a really sort of low floor, high ceiling. You can be really basic with it. Like, what is that a picture of? If you have like a CASA student, I'm not sure, like super young, what is that? And then they can say, or you can move it way up and go, what's the middle sound in that word? And have them actually have to sound it out. And then they move their pawn, you roll the dice, and you continue to the end. So games like this are perfect if you have kids at different levels. All right. The next one is phonics. And phonics is sort of the natural lead-in, right? Phonemic awareness or phonological awareness, what we just discussed, it goes hand in hand with phonics, but typically phonics comes after there's some development because phonics is where we start to see the relationship between the letter and the sound come together. So when it comes to phonics, this has been a really fascinating conversation over the past number of years because we've kind of gone back and forth as a province of, do we like phonics? Do we not like phonics? But the research has been stable that phonics is important. It's not the only thing, but it's important for reading. So something that I would suggest is, when it comes to working on a phonics skill, typically we want to start with a letter. A vowel is a great one to work on because vowels are in every word and in every syllable. So I'm just using the example of an A here, specifically the most common sound of A, which is ah. So if you have a child who's, trying to read, they're working on reading, or they're ready to read, and you have this opportunity maybe at home to try and support them, rather than just reading to them or putting a book in front of them, I like to encourage you to focus in on a specific letter, a specific sound, and then the print correspondence. So you'll see here, I have a capital letter, I have a lowercase letter, and then I have 3 of these symbols here. This stands for A, apple, ah. This is really important for our kids to know because we want them to know the letter name, the keyword, which is a common word that begins with that sound of ah, as well as the most common sound. So if ah is my main focus, I might want to look online and do different strategies like focusing on words that contain the ah, having them, again, mark, moving from the print here, like app, to actually clicking on, or sorry, not clicking, pinning, right, the different picture. So they're moving from the print to the picture and back, right? That helps to build the comprehension and the reading skill. And we also want to work on reading books that focus in on that letter. That's really, really key, especially for our beginning learners or our struggling learners. Now, phonics is not just reading, it is also spelling. And so, hopefully, I know it does seem a bit overwhelming because there's lots that you can do. But if you even just go on Google and, you type in science of reading, free, short A. Again, I'm going to be posting all of these. But if you type in something that's focusing on the apple A, you're going to get all sorts of great resources like this, where the students can actually work on spelling using that letter as well. Okay. And that's going to be really, really key so that they're making that connection between the print, the sound, the way it looks, and then how it fits into a word. And you can see how it builds. I will also say, with any of the Mildenhall teachers too, you can ask them and see what they're working on, and if there's anything that that they would suggest you try at home. For example, if it's a certain phonics concept, or if there are certain letter length or word lengths that they're working on, like consonant vowel consonants, which you'll see here, right? Like k, at. You can see if they're working on those and then how you can support at home. But those teachers are a fabulous resource. All right. What I want to mention is that phonics is a really great way to introduce sort of a multisensory approach. And again, that is such a huge, huge component of Montessori learning too. So something that we want to make sure we're doing when we're working with a new letter or a new concept is roping in as many senses as we can, right? And so auditory is really key. I never get my students to read silently. Especially if it's just me and them, they're reading out loud so that they're getting the auditory feedback. We want to also make sure that they're getting the touch in. And so either it's, touching the words as they read, or if they're a little bit, if that's a little bit advanced, actually tracing the letters. So you can see here, there's a lot of different tactile examples of that. In a glittery bag, you can use shaving cream, sand. I know Montessori, uses the sandpaper letters. Those are all tactile feedback that the students can get to really cement that letter and the sound correspondence. Of course, they're using their sense of sight, and moving is also fabulous. So if you have a really squirmy one, getting them, if they're learning about the A saying ah for apple, you can even have them trace it with their foot on the wall, or having them trace it in carpet, right? It's really, the world is your oyster, but we want to get all these senses going at once. All right. So I want to be as quick as I can on this because I could probably talk forever about the difference between controlled or decodable books and leveled books. This is definitely a question that comes under phonics. And if you're familiar with it, these are sort of two different types of stories that we're seeing out and about today with our children, right? We're seeing books that are beautiful, fabulous, nothing wrong with them, that have a lot of different words. And you can see here the colors actually correspond to the types of syllables that are present in those books. So that's a whole other discussion on what that means. But in short, these are words that that might have a vowel saying two different things. Like A can say ah, or it can say A. Sometimes they can say So it has a lot of different things for our students to figure out. And I find that this is our goal, right? We want to get to a place where our students can read anything that they come across. But for an emerging learner or a student who's struggling to read, we don't want to throw that at them. Even if it's interesting, this is a great example over here of the leveled reader to read out loud to them at night and to engage them with the love of reading. But when they're actually reading, we want to try our best to focus in on controlled readers that focus on a phonics concept. So if they were just learning ah, you'll see over to the right here, there's those books on the mat, right? Or what was this? Lad on my pad. Sorry, my face is blocking it. So that's just sort of a quick distinction. If you've ever heard about decodable books, they're controlled and they focus in on a phonics concept. Usually they're appropriate for practicing the process of reading, but also for bigger questions like reading comprehension and new vocabulary. Speaking of vocabulary, This is the third piece of the science of reading, one of those one of those five components. Vocabulary is pretty straightforward. It is just something that, we pick up whether we realize it or not, but we can expedite that in our children. A big one is talking to our kids, which it sounds weird to say. I think anybody who's on here cares a lot about their children. But really, really taking the opportunity to talk with them, engage with them about their day, gives them this vocabulary, right? Some other ways that you can build vocabulary are things like I spy, Simon says, rhyming songs. Some students really love to label things, right? So, leaning into that urge and helping them to label things around the house in their environment, and maybe even giving them other names that people might call the things in our home. Same with open-ended play. Can't emphasize that enough. Imaginative play, where your child can be creative and dialogue with others is key to also building vocabulary. All right. The rest here, I think if you're watching in, you can see, but new places to visit, reading signs, reading plaques, those are really great too. If you go to the zoo, actually reading about those animals and what they're doing. Those can all help build vocabulary outside of reading. Comprehension is the next piece. So when your child is reading or when you're reading to your child, it's really, really important to check in and make sure that they're understanding what's going on. And one way to do this is using those 5 Ws: who, what, where, why, when, to ask. And this is not something you have to really practice for. As you're reading to them, you could, stop. And if you are thinking, oh, something big's about to happen, or there's going to be a consequence in this story, you pause and you go, what do you think is going to happen next? And having that conversation with them, so critical for comprehension as well as, the skill of prediction. Same with older students too. If they are at the end of a story, you can ask them, like, how would you have written that story differently or ended that story? Or what do you think will happen next in a sequel? Right. So this goes for young kids all the way up to old kids. We really need to engage with them beyond just, here's the book. We need to ask them questions about it. And the last is fluency. Now, fluency is kind of a natural sort of end point or progression after students have built on a lot of these skills. It's not actually something you can click and boom, suddenly students are fluent. Fluency is something that has to be practiced. And it's best if they're practicing on text that they can truly decode, they can truly sound out, and they're not just guessing on. And over time, fluency becomes that ability for them to read almost in a way that feels effortless, like I'm sure many of us do, in a way where they can focus on the content and not on figuring out, what does this word actually say? When they get to that point and they can think about the text as a way to learn, that's a big piece of that fluency. So something that you can do at home to help build this is practicing reading, those targeted or those controlled readers, but also when a student is reading, having them practice it in different voices is a really fun way because it gets the repetition that we need, but also has them practice, the performance element of reading out loud, right? Because it is a performance. You have to change your voice. And so modeling that is really, really great. And you can have a lot of fun with it too. All right. I want to quickly go into some pre-reading skills. So before it actually comes to text, I want to talk about some other things that we can work on with young ones. I know there's a lot of parents and guardians of young ones here, CASA. So I just want to make sure that we're covering some of those. And then I'm going to go into some benchmarks that we can look at for your Montessori child. And then there'll be one or two more things before we are done. So this list that I put together here is sort of starting at CASA, but if CASA students have this, it's, assumed that the older students will too. So if any of your children of any age struggle with any of these, this is something that I really encourage you to work on because they're all going to help with reading. So one of them is working on memorizing their address and phone numbers. So this is sort of a hint towards something we call working memory, which is often quite weak. That's the ability for us to hold on to pieces of information and then to act on them. So if I said, clean your room, take out the trash, then put on your shoes and jacket to go. Remembering all three of those can be tricky. And typically, any human, any person will typically have around 7 units of working memory. So at any given point, we could remember as an adult about 7 things. But for children and also students who have dyslexia, for example, or poor working memory, they may only have 3 or fewer units of that working memory. So we want to help build that. There's many ways to do it. Might be another chat, but for now, we want to help make sure that they are able to remember really important details like their address and phone number. If they struggle with that, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do. Tying shoes. That's also a good one. Coordination, working across, different hemispheres of the brain, left to right games, and also observing the left to right movement of reading, right? And Montessori does that really, really well. I know with the young ones, they're always moving left to right. Fine motor skill development, right? Students need to be able to flip through the book, holding a pencil. All of those are going to make it easier so that when they're ready to read and spell, they're not fumbling too much and having to focus too much on the technicalities of it, of actually, holding a pencil or holding a book, for example. Alphabet awareness. So knowledge of the letters of the alphabet and then the letter sound correspondences. So knowing their letter names and their letter sounds. Even if they're not super solid, this is a great thing for us to be working on as soon as our students are showing an interest and readiness. Okay. Ability to write their name, bonus points if they can do their last name, but especially their first name. It's okay if it's not all lowercase with the capital first. We just want to get them writing their name. Key. Listening comprehension. Can they follow stories and simple instructions? We want to help them train them for that in a sense, for future reading and spelling. The phonemic awareness we talked about, and the vocabulary we talked about too. These are all things we can do, before they're having to do a ton of writing and reading. Okay, let's talk about some benchmarks. And I would love if there's anything else that the team at Milden Hall would like to add in or change, let me know. But these are some of the benchmarks that I'm familiar with in a Montessori setting, but also just something in general we want to aim for if we can. And if not, this is a great conversation that you can have with the teacher, pediatrician, etc. So from ages 2 to 4, there's a good emphasis on building vocabulary, right, through conversation, songs, etc. I've already sort of talked about that. The phonemic awareness, right? We want to make sure that kids are at least working on it, even if they're not total pros yet. Sound games like I Spy, sandpaper letters that they do, and then object and word matching. We want them to start creating connections between their environment and, if we can, print. But don't worry if that's not the case, because when they're 5 and older, they'll be working on it. So ages 4 to 6, it's a continuation. Ideally, they have some skills that we've mentioned, but we also start to see a child decoding simple phonetic words, which means you can sound them out and the letters are going to match the sound in a way that makes sense. I'll explain what the opposite of that is in just a few points. Movable alphabet. So being able to, sorry, my face is blocking this again. So being able to use a sets of letters and to move them around to, create the alphabet and work towards that is fabulous. Also knowing some sight words. Sight words are sort of the opposite of phonetic words because they're the words that you can't really sound out, even if you try. So, for example, said, looks like sade, right? From looks like from. If a student tries to sound that out, they're going to go, what? Right? It's a bit frustrating. So some of these words do need to be learned by sight or by heart. And one way to practice those is by a lot of tactile tracing in various, tactile media. But that's also something that they're working on in school. And then reading simple books, right? So again, those consonant, vowel, consonants, cat, dog, mat, all of that. Moving on to the next benchmark. So for ages 6 to 9, right? So they're in early elementary, lower elementary at this point. The focus begins to incorporate reading comprehension, so making sense of what they're reading. Also introducing parts of speech, so understanding what a noun is or what a verb is, to help them make sense of phrases within sentences. So we know what the subject is or what they're doing, and how to phrase it when they're speaking as well. Paragraphs, maybe a little bit older, but starting to understand and read longer form text. And then also function words. So different types of words that can connect our phrases and sentences together. And then for the older ones, 9 to 12, this is, again, the building on everything we've said, reading more complex texts and engaging more in depth with literary material. So in sort of the public school space, we often call this sort of the reading to learn. And so when they're younger, they're learning to read and actually figure out that text. But then we hit this point where they should begin reading to learn. The idea is that they have a lot of the reading skills needed to succeed at reading longer form text. Critical thinking. Again, those are the things we could practice with those stories I was mentioning, with reading comprehension, and then research projects. So I know Montessori has a huge emphasis on that. And we want to continue to encourage this and encourage the use of text as well, so that they're reading things about their interests and not just hearing it on YouTube. Nothing wrong with that, but just an example. All right. Something that I do want to point out too, a lot of the students that I see and work with are dyslexic. And dyslexia is one of the most common disabilities. It is actually affecting about 20% of people worldwide. And so something that I think is really important to mention, of course, cannot diagnose and I'm not diagnosing, but sometimes, given how prevalent it can be, it's important for us to be able to sort of look at our children, and if there's certain things that they're struggling with at certain points, it doesn't mean that they have dyslexia per se, but I just want to, just from my experience, I just want to sort of encourage, if anybody's feeling like I'm going to wait or things will turn out okay, I just want to cut that thinking off. It might be, but if you have doubts about where your child is in terms of reading, don't be afraid to pursue that, right? I know the teachers are definitely going to want to hear and work with you and give some feedback. But dyslexia is common. It's not a bad word. It's something that a lot of students experience, a lot of adults experience. And so I just popped here. It's based from my website, but a couple of different signs that you may want to look into dyslexia. Again, does not mean that they have it, but if you see here, I'll just give you a quick sec to read some. Those are some of the preschool signs. Elementary. So again, this is in the absence of other factors. For example, English is a second language, right? Of course, there might be choppy writing, there might be difficulties understanding the language, right? But if you're finding, you have a student who is an English speaker, and or if you have a history of dyslexia in the family, then it's just something that I encourage folks to look into. And everything we've mentioned today is also very, very dyslexia friendly. In fact, one of the only ways to really reach our children with dyslexia. I want to just, before I end off, I want to talk quickly about some of the myths of reading as well, just to make sure we're ending on a note where we're feeling a little bit more empowered. When it comes to reading, there's a lot of things that I think all of you and myself were sort of raised with, and perhaps this is something that we do with our children. Um, because when it comes to reading, for a very long time, the science of reading hasn't been followed. There's a whole slew of reasons why that could be, but we've tended to not in Mildenhall, but just in the province and in North America more broadly, we tend to focus on something called balanced literacy or whole language literacy. And this is something that kind of emphasizes the joy and the curiosity of reading, but not as much of an emphasis on the mechanics of it. And so where structured literacy and the science of reading, Orton-Gillingham, all these buzzwords I'm putting out, where they come together is in making sure the mechanics are strong so that our students have the foundation they need. Plus, you know, not just the foundations, but they also have the desire and the joy. We want to balance those, but truly balance them, not just kind of put a book in their face because we know they like them. And we know they like trucks, so we're just giving them a truck book. We want to build the how of how to read. And so what I'm going to show you, it's something from my presentation last year about some of the common things that we've learned and we may do with our kids that actually do not have a basis in or any scientific backing for helping them to read. So some may surprise you. I'd be curious to hear. So one of them is looking at the first letter. It has the right idea because we do want to move from left to right. But what this is encouraging is guessing. And so reading is not guessing. It is not, even if it feels sometimes like we're thinking about the context, that's more about comprehension, right? But actually reading a word like elephant here, it's not going to happen by just being like, hey, what's the first letter? It's an E. E is the most common letter in English. Anything could be starting with an E. Then what does that word look like? That sort of encourages our students to memorize the shape of words. And again, that's actually not how the brain learns to read, even if it feels like it sometimes. We're reading something and we're like, oh, I get it. It kind of looks like this. That is not how the brain learns to read. So we don't really want to be asking, what does it look like? Again, we want to get them sounding out from left to right. Same with, let's skip this word and read the rest of the sentence. We'll go back and see what word makes sense. That is a great exercise in context clues, which is a great skill, but it's not reading, if that makes sense. It's not actually figuring out what the word says based on the letters and the sound symbol correspondence. Then look at the picture. What is that? Yes, it's an elephant. This number 4 is probably the one that I see the most, and I think it's a big reason why a lot of students start to struggle in grade 4 or in, I guess, upper elementary. Again, I don't want to use the Montessori example. It's more just what I see. But usually once we start removing pictures from text, like chapter books, things like that, this advice is no longer helpful, right? That's when there's like, oh, wait, what do these words say? There is no elephant on this page. Right? It's like, how would they know unless they can rely on the sound symbol correspondence in the letters? So this one we really want to avoid, but it doesn't mean we can't enjoy the pictures. So usually if a student's working on reading, they can read it and then you could go, oh, isn't that elephant cute? Or, oh my goodness, I love the bird on his foot. Or, ooh, like, I don't know, you could ask them about questions about an elephant or how is that elephant feeling? Oh, he looks really happy. Because that's not based on the text. It's not getting them to guess what the text actually means. It's kind of reinforcing the art and the emotions that a character might feel, which I would argue is a great thing to build on, right? After reading a passage. And then the last one is, let's read this book together every night this week. You'll be a pro. It sounds fine, right? The thing is, if we're reading the same book over and over and over again, it starts to turn from reading it into memorizing it. Doesn't mean that you can't read a book over and over with your kids, but if they're struggling to read and you go, oh, they can't really read much but this book, They love it. They read it all the time. It's the only thing that they'll touch. Then it might not be reading. It might be memorization. So I just want to encourage you to, to kind of keep that in mind. If you have a child who is really, really hooked on this one book that they've heard a million times, but they won't try anything else, or they can't read anything else. That's where, anyway, that's just where we have to kind of have our spidey sense going and realize, yeah, is it memorization or is it true reading? So I just want to leave you with that. Again, I will be sending over through Rebecca resources that I've sort of mentioned or that you've seen on the screen today, as well as a list of different decodable books. So those controlled books that you can work on with your child, in collaboration with their teacher. So I just wanted to, thank you all again for joining. And we only have a few minutes, but I would love to take any questions if any were up in the chat.